Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, for sure.
Like, it's like engineering. You know, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged, glowing white line on the film, and the doctor just points at it and says, yep, there it is. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's totally binary. It's either broken or not broken.
Right.
And, well, it's clean, it's visible, and I think most importantly, it's comforting. I mean, human beings love things that can be neatly categorized.
But then, you step into the world of global finance and macroeconomics, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just totally malfunctioning.
Complete.
We're looking at a financial landscape today that is, honestly, incredibly murky. I mean, we are staring down a number right now that feels like it shouldn't even exist outside of, like, theoretical physics or astronomy.
Yeah, it's a very big number.
$36 trillion. That is the current national debt of the United States.
Just the U.S., yeah.
It's the U.S., and if you think that's a lot, the global debt, the combined borrowed money of the entire planet, is currently sitting at a staggering $300 trillion.
Yeah, and when you start dealing with numbers that large, the human brain simply isn't equipped to process them.
No, not at all.
$300 trillion completely escapes our everyday evolutionary understanding of what money is. It's basically the ultimate diagnostic muddy water.
I actually tried to visualize this just to wrap my head around it before we sat down today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so think about a stack of $1 million bills. And not singles, but like $1 million bills, assuming they existed.
Okay, assuming they existed.
Right, a stack of $1 million in a single pile is roughly the height of a 30-story building.
Wow.
Just $1 million, 30 stories high. Now take $1 billion.
Okay.
That stack reaches 100 kilometers high, which is enough to literally touch the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. Like, you are officially in space.
It's a striking image, and that's just 1 billion.
Right. So then you get to the $300 trillion mark. That stack of bills goes to the moon and back.
Unbelievable.
And not just once, not twice, 50 times.
50 times.
50 times to the moon and back. I mean, that is the sheer amount of debt we are talking about on this planet right now.
It really is.
So the central question, right, the one that is definitely on the mind of every single person listening to us right now, is this. If every single country on Earth is in debt, who exactly are we all paying back?
That is the million, or I guess trillion-dollar question.
Like, are there Martians secretly approving our loan applications up there?
I mean, it is the most logical question you could ask. And, well, the reason it feels like such a paradox highlights a fundamental misunderstanding we have about how money operates on a planetary scale.
Okay, how so?
Well, on an individual level, debt is incredibly linear.
Yeah.
I borrow from you, so I owe you.
Right, it's simple.
Exactly. But on a global scale, the math gets wonderfully and terrifyingly weird.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is our mission for this deep dive.
Let's do it.
We are going to demystify the mechanics of global debt for a complete beginner. We want to explain exactly how this interconnected web impacts you in your everyday life.
Right, because it really does.
From the stability of your job to the security of your pension funds. We're going to figure out whether this $300 trillion mountain going to the moon and back 50 times is like a fragile house of cards ready to collapse, or if it's actually the engine powering the modern world.
And what's fascinating here is that while the numbers seem absolutely terrifying on the surface, understanding the balance sheet of the planet reveals a surprisingly elegant, closed-loop system.
A closed loop. Okay.
Yeah, to really get why the global economy hasn't collapsed under the weight of this debt, we have to stop looking at debt as a giant pile of unpaid bills and start looking at it as a circular system.
Interesting.
But to truly understand the mechanics of that loop, we really need to look backwards.
Far backwards, I'm assuming. Because debt feels like a very modern invention,
It does feel that way.
It feels like a spreadsheet issue, something cooked up by guys in tailored suits on Wall Street in the 1980s.
Right, right.
But debt is actually one of the oldest ideas in human history. Long before banks, before coins, before paper money, I mean, debt was simply a promise.
Exactly. To understand the 300 trillion, you really have to understand the bag of grain.
The bag of grain. Okay, walk me through that.
So imagine you were living in a small agricultural village thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's late spring.
Okay, I'm there.
The winter was harsh, you've run out of food, and your family is hungry. But your neighbor across the valley had a better harvest last year, and, well, he has a surplus of grain.
So I'm going to go ask for some.
Right. You go to them and ask to borrow a bag of grain just to survive until your own crops are ready to harvest in the fall.
Makes sense.
And when that harvest comes, you pay them back the bag of grain and, maybe you give them a little extra out of gratitude.
Just to ensure they'll help you again in the future. So there are no interest rates, there's no complicated legal contracts, no central banks aggressively monitoring inflation.
Nothing like that.
It's just pure interpersonal trust.
Yeah, and look at the mechanism there. You are borrowing from tomorrow to solve a problem today.
Wow, yeah.
That is the core, unshakable definition of debt. You need something right now to survive or progress, but you only have the capacity to pay for it later.
And for thousands of years, that was basically the limit of debt, right? Like it was physical and it was hyper-local.
Pretty much.
But as societies grew, human ambitions grew. Kings wanted bigger castles, expanding empires needed larger ships and more cannons.
Oh, absolutely.
And eventually you just hit a wall because no single neighbor, no matter how wealthy they were, had enough grain, or gold, I guess, to fund a multi-year war or build an entire naval armada.
Right, which is where we see the first major structural shift in how humanity handles borrowing.
When was this?
Well, if we jump forward to the 1600s, things transitioned from personal favors to early global markets. Take King Charles II of England.
Okay.
He is preparing for the Second Anglo-Dutch War. And wars are, and always have been, astronomically expensive.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You have to pay soldiers, build ships, forge weapons, supply food, but the royal treasury is completely empty.
And usually a king would just go to the wealthy nobles and demand a loan, right?
Normally, yes. But the wealthy nobles were looking at the history of European monarchs who had a nasty habit of simply executing their creditors or, refusing to pay them back. And they essentially said, no.
Wow, just flat out no.
That we're not lending you our personal fortunes for this. So the traditional avenues of funding were closed, and the king couldn't just raise taxes indefinitely on the peasants without sparking a bloody revolt.
So what do? Because the war is happening whether they can afford it or not.
The state tried an entirely new financial innovation.
What was it?
Instead of asking one rich person for £1 million, they decided to ask 1 million ordinary people for £1.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they sold pieces of the king's debt to the general public.
So they crowdsourced it.
It's exactly. In return for handing over their cash today, ordinary citizens received a written, legally binding promise from the state that they would be repaid later.
Plus interest, I assume.
Right, plus a reliable percentage of interest. This was the birth of the modern government bond.
It's such a simple conceptual shift, but it completely revolutionized state finance.
It really did.
Because suddenly, governments could raise massive, unprecedented sums of money without having to immediately raise taxes or drain whatever gold was left in their vaults.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this was the exact moment debt transitioned from being a desperate, localized measure between individuals to a massive structural tool for nations.
That makes total sense.
And it worked so incredibly well that over the next few centuries, bond markets went entirely global.
Right.
By the time we hit the 20th century, World War I and World War II pushed countries to borrow on a scale that made King Charles's naval fleet look like a rounding error.
I mean, they had to.
Yeah, nations weren't just borrowing to fight. They were borrowing to rebuild entire blasted continents from the rubble.
Which perfectly sets the stage for 1944, right? The Bretton Woods Agreement.
Yes. A huge turning point.
This is one of those historical moments that completely rewires the planet. Like, the world is trying to figure out how to stabilize a shattered global economy after the Second World War.
Exactly.
So the delegates gather in New Hampshire, and they make a monumental decision. They make the U.S. dollar the centerpiece of the entire global financial system.
Yep, the reserve currency.
Right. All these other international currencies are tied to the value of the U.S. dollar. And the U.S. dollar, crucially, is tied directly to the value of physical gold.
$35 for an ounce of gold.
Wow.
This is a vital mechanic to understand because it dictated how the world grew for decades. Tying the dollar to gold meant there was a physical, tangible tether on the global economy.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, in theory, every U.S. dollar printed was supposed to be backed by a corresponding amount of gold sitting securely in a vault, like Fort Knox.
So it was a physical ceiling. You couldn't just print endless amounts of money to fund whatever project you wanted because you literally had to dig up more gold to justify it.
Precisely. It enforced a strict discipline on government borrowing.
But there's a flaw there, right?
There's a fatal flaw in that system. Economies naturally need to grow. Populations expand, businesses innovate, international trade increases.
Right, things get bigger.
And as the United States ramped up its spending globally in the 1950s and 60s, funding the Cold War, the space race, massive domestic social programs, the Vietnam War, there simply wasn't enough physical gold on planet Earth to back the flood of dollars needed to keep the global economy expanding at that pace.
The physical tether was literally choking the system.
Yeah, it was.
And other countries started getting nervous, looking at all these dollars floating around and realizing the U.S. didn't actually have the gold to back them up if everyone asked for it at once.
They started demanding their gold back. France famously sent a battleship to New York Harbor to physically collect their gold in exchange for their dollars.
A literal battleship. That's intense.
It's essentially a run on the national bank.
So in 1971, President Richard Nixon makes a move that fundamentally alters human history.
Yes, the Nixon shock.
He goes on television and completely breaks the link between the dollar and gold. He ends the gold standard.
And with the stroke of a pen, money transitioned into what we now call fiat currency.
Fiat.
Yep. Fiat is Latin for let it be done. The currency was no longer backed by gold or silver or a bag of grain or anything physical you could hold in your hand.
So what was it backed by?
It was backed purely by government decree, by trust in the United States government.
Wait, hold on. If money is just a decree, if the government can essentially create it digitally at will without needing a physical block of gold in a vault, isn't that an absolute recipe for endless, uncontrolled borrowing?
It absolutely was. The shift to fiat currency completely removed the physical ceiling on human borrowing.
Really? Just took the brakes off.
Yeah, you can see it in the charts. From the 1980s onwards, global debt just exploded upwards.
Wow.
Governments realized that borrowing wasn't just a grim necessity for fighting wars or surviving famines anymore. Debt could be used as a proactive, continuous tool to fuel economic growth.
So they realized they could borrow to build schools, lay down thousands of miles of interstate highways, fund deep scientific research,
Exactly.
and, crucially, to spend their way out of recessions.
Yes. Debt evolved from being a last resort into the standard, everyday engine for progress in both advanced and developing nations.
That's a huge shift.
Today, debt is simply how things get built. It's how crises get managed. It's the norm. And that brings us back to our stack of bills reaching the moon 50 times.
Oh, right, the 300 trillion.
That is the exact mechanism of how we hit $300 trillion. The shift to fiat fundamentally altered our behavioral relationship with money. It allowed debt to become a permanent, structural feature of civilization rather than a temporary emergency measure.
But wait, if debt, going all the way back to your grain analogy, is simply borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today, aren't we eventually going to wake up to a tomorrow where the pantry is completely empty?
That's what people always assume.
Right, because think about your own credit card or your mortgage. You are participating in this exact same ancient practice of pulling future resources into the present.
Sure.
But if you keep putting things on your credit card, eventually you hit a hard limit. Eventually the bill comes due, your credit score tanks, and you can't pay it. Why hasn't the world maxed out its credit card?
Well, this is where the personal finance analogy completely breaks down when applied to global macroeconomics.
Okay, why?
It's a mistake we all make because household budgets are our only frame of reference. To understand why we haven't run out of tomorrows, we have to fundamentally rethink who is holding the other end of that $300 trillion string.
Which means we need to transition from the history of how we got here to the modern mechanics of who is actually involved.
Exactly.
Because knowing that the limits were taken off in 1971 explains the sheer size of the number, but it still doesn't answer who holds the bag today. Like, if we aren't paying Martians, who exactly is cashing these astronomical checks?
Let's break down the most common misconception first. When people think of national debt, they inevitably picture some shadowy cabal.
Oh, totally.
They imagine a foreign power pulling the strings, holding all the financial leverage over a country, waiting to foreclose on the nation.
You hear it at every family dinner, right? Like, China owns America.
Oh, right.
And sure, if you look at the raw data, China does hold a massive amount of U.S. debt, about $750 billion worth.
It's true.
But the plot twist here is that China is also drowning in its own staggering pile of debt, over $18 trillion of it.
Exactly. And if you trace who holds China's debt, you find that a massive portion of it sits with domestic Chinese banks.
Okay.
But those exact same Chinese banks also own debt from the United States.
Okay.
And American banks are holding debt from China and Europe and almost everyone else.
It's completely entangled. It's not a straight line of one country owing another. It's a messy web where every country is borrowing and every country is lending simultaneously.
To clear the muddy waters, let's zoom in on the United States as our prime example.
Okay, let's do that.
The U.S. is the single most indebted country on the planet,
Right,
sitting at that $36 trillion mark.
right.
But roughly 70% of that U.S. debt is actually owed to Americans themselves.
Wait, really? Let that sink in for a second for you listening. The United States government owes 70% of its massive multi-trillion-dollar debt to its own citizens and its own domestic institutions.
Yes.
It is literally borrowing from itself.
Yes, exactly. When the government needs money to build a bridge or fund the military, it issues bonds. Those written promises with interest we talked about from the 1600s.
Okay, the crowdsourcing.
Right. And the people buying those bonds are essentially you.
Okay, let's walk through this mechanism step by step so we can see how the plumbing actually works. Let's put this in the shoes of someone listening to us right now. It's Friday, you get your paycheck, and you transfer a chunk of your earnings into your regular bank savings account.
Right. Now, when you deposit that money, the bank does not take your physical cash, walk it down to a giant cartoonish metal vault, and let it sit there gathering dust.
That would be terrible for them.
Exactly. That money is useless to them sitting idle. To run their business, they need to put your money to work.
Right.
They need to grow it so they can pay you that tiny bit of interest on your savings account and keep a profit for themselves.
So the bank takes the money I just deposited, and they look around for the safest possible place to invest it. Because they can't afford to lose my deposits in, like, a risky tech startup.
No, they cannot.
And what is universally considered safer than the United States government?
Practically speaking, nothing. The U.S. government has never defaulted on its sovereign debt. So the bank takes your savings and uses it to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. As of the latest data, commercial banks in the U.S. hold nearly $1.8 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds.
Just to put $1.8 trillion in perspective, for you listening, that is triple the entire gross domestic product of countries like Brazil or Canada.
It's massive.
That staggering amount is just the bonds held by regular commercial banks.
And bonds are incredibly popular for banks because they are the ultimate safe harbor to earn interest on spare cash.
Right.
Think about the stock market. It's volatile, it bounces up and down, it crashes. A government bond offers a fixed, guaranteed return.
Oh, it's predictable.
Very. If you buy a 10-year U.S. government bond today, it pays a steady, reliable 4.5% interest per year. That's near zero risk for a guaranteed yield.
So my personal savings account is directly funding the federal government. But it's not just banks doing this, right?
Not at all. It's any entity sitting on a massive pool of cash that needs to grow safely over time.
Like who?
Think about your pension fund, or think about insurance companies.
Oh, right.
You pay your monthly car insurance premium, and the insurance company holds onto that cash until they need to pay out a claim.
Which might be years from now.
Exactly. In the meantime, they invest it. In 2024, U.S. pension funds invested a full 25% of all their accumulated money into government bonds.
Wow.
And insurance companies placed over 60% of their entire asset portfolios into bonds.
60%. Well, because if you are an insurance company, you absolutely cannot risk losing the money you might need to pay out hurricane claims tomorrow in a sudden stock market crash today.
Right. You need that ironclad, reliable 4.5% return.
So what we're really talking about is a vast hidden network.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it. It is a hidden network where the everyday savings of the public become the immediate loan money for the government.
That is so wild.
The U.S. borrowing from itself is simply money flowing from parts of the economy where it's sitting idle, like a retirement account that a 30-year-old won't touch for another 3 decades, to parts of the economy where the government needs to spend it immediately to build a highway.
So basically, we shouldn't view debt as a terrifying pile of unpaid bills. It's more like a closed-loop water fountain.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so the water, which is the money, gets pumped up from the government borrowing it. They spray it out into the economy by paying construction workers, funding research grants, paying government salaries.
Yes.
And then that money flows down into our banks, our businesses, our pension funds. And then the banks and pension funds pump it right back up to the government by using those exact same savings to buy more bonds.
That analogy is mathematically spot on.
Yeah.
And the engine that keeps the water pumping, the electricity running the fountain, is the interest payment.
Okay, explain that.
When the government pays that 4.5% interest on its debt, that cash flows right back into the hands of the lenders, the banks, and the pension funds.
Right.
So they now have even more spare cash than they started with, and what do they do with that extra cash?
They use it to buy more bonds.
Exactly. It is a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The money constantly cycles through the exact same system.
Lender to borrower, borrower spends it back to the lender.
Yes. Lender to borrower, borrower spends it into the economy, economy saves it back to lender, back to borrower. The money never truly leaves the system. It just continually changes hands.
And this isn't just an isolated American phenomenon, though. You mentioned earlier that roughly 30% of U.S. debt is held overseas. How does the international web fit into this closed-loop fountain analogy?
It operates by the exact same logic, just stretched across international borders.
Give me an example.
Okay, say a factory worker in Japan saves their money in a Tokyo bank. The Japanese bank takes those savings and loans them to a Dutch financial institution looking for capital.
Okay.
The Dutch pension funds take their extra cash and loan it to Brazilian banks. And the Brazilian financial institutions take that cash and look for the safest place on earth to store it.
So they buy U.S. Treasury bonds.
Exactly.
That is wild. So Japanese savings become Dutch loans, which become Brazilian loans, which eventually flow back to fund the U.S. government building a bridge in Ohio.
The world's debt is an incredibly complex, interconnected web of these circular systems. Savers to borrowers and back again.
And as long as the music keeps playing.
Right. As long as governments continue to borrow, investors continue to lend, and the interest payments are reliably made, the cycle keeps moving.
So the biggest takeaway here for you, the listener, is that you are the lender. You might feel totally disconnected from a $36 trillion national debt figure you see on the news, but your personal savings account, your 401k, your future pension, those are the very instruments funding national government spending cycles.
They absolutely are.
Your daily financial life is a crucial node in the $300 trillion loop.
Which naturally leads us to the next massive question.
Which is?
If the government is constantly borrowing your money, pumping it out of the fountain to spend it, what exactly are they spending it on?
Right.
And is it actually helping you? Or is it just padding a spreadsheet in a Treasury Department somewhere?
Because it's clearly not a smooth, perfectly steady flow of water in that fountain. Economies don't just hum along at a flat rate forever.
No, they don't.
There are massive surges, and there are terrifying droughts.
Economists refer to this as the natural boom and bust cycle. Even without a major unpredictable external shock like a global war or a sudden pandemic, the global economy naturally breathes in and out.
Like a rhythm.
Yes, it goes through a cycle roughly every 10 years.
And this cycle is driven heavily by human psychology and our collective borrowing habits, right?
Absolutely. Think about how people behave when times are good.
They spend.
Yeah, when employment is high, when your friends are getting promotions, and people feel highly confident about the future, individuals and businesses are far more willing to take on debt.
That makes sense.
They feel secure enough to buy a new house, businesses take out loans to build new factories, people finance a new car.
Because they're not worried about losing their jobs next month.
Exactly. This massive influx of borrowed money boosts consumer spending and investment, which makes the economy boom even harder. It's euphoria.
But eventually, that debt level gets a little too high. People look at their bank statements and realize, okay, I have a massive mortgage, 2 car payments, and credit card debt.
Yeah, reality sets in.
I have to stop buying new stuff and focus on making my monthly repayments.
And when everyone comes to that exact same psychological realization at roughly the same time, they all stop spending simultaneously to pay down their debts.
So consumption falls off a cliff.
Yes. Suddenly, local businesses are making less money, so they stop expanding. They might have to lay people off. Overall economic output drops.
This is the bust.
This is the bust, or this sluggish, painful period of the cycle.
So we, the general public, create these waves of booms and busts purely through our collective emotional behavior regarding borrowing.
Mostly, yes.
So what is the government's role in all of this? Are they just supposed to ride the wave with us?
Actually, the role of the government is designed to be the exact opposite. They are supposed to implement what economists call counter-cyclical fiscal policy.
Counter-cyclical, meaning going against whatever the cycle is doing.
Precisely. When the economy is booming and the public is taking on tons of debt and spending wildly, the government is supposed to tap the brakes.
How do they do that?
They should raise taxes slightly and cut back on government spending. They need to suck some of that excess water out of the fountain and save up money so the economy doesn't overheat and trigger massive inflation.
But then, during a bust like the brutal 2008 global financial crisis, or the sudden 2020 COVID crisis, when everyone is terrified, people are losing their jobs, and everyone is hoarding their cash under the mattress, the government must do the exact opposite.
Right.
They have to step in, borrow heavily, and spend massively to keep the economic engine from stalling out completely.
Think about the spring of 2020. The entire world just stopped.
It was terrifying.
People were locked in their homes, businesses were shuttered by decree, and consumer spending evaporated overnight. If the government hadn't stepped in, the economic collapse would have been catastrophic. Businesses would have failed by the millions.
So they just dumped money into the system.
Yeah, so in that single year, 2020, the U.S. government borrowed an astonishing $3.8 trillion.
Wow.
That was nearly 20% of their entire gross domestic product borrowed in just 12 months. And China, Europe, the UK, everyone did the exact same thing.
It wasn't a policy choice, it was raw survival. They had to inject a massive surge of water into the fountain because the public had completely turned their own taps off.
Exactly.
But here's the stark political reality, and this seems to be the fatal flaw in the entire system. Politicians absolutely love being the hero during a crisis.
Oh, of course they do.
They love signing their names on stimulus checks, funding rescue programs, cutting ribbons on new projects. But during a boom, no politician on earth wants to be the one who stands up at a podium, raises taxes, and cuts popular spending programs.
It is the harsh truth of countercyclical policy. Implementing austerity during good times costs elections.
Right?
Telling the public that the party is over, the punch bowl is being taken away, and it's time to save money is incredibly unpopular.
Exactly. If politicians know they theoretically should save during a boom, but absolutely won't because they want to get reelected, are we basically relying on a system where human psychology mathematically guarantees the national debt will only ever go up?
That is exactly the reality we live in. Because the political will to rein in spending during good times is almost completely non-existent across the globe, borrowing becomes an inevitable, endless, one-way ratchet.
It just clicks forward.
Yes, the debt only grows. It never meaningfully shrinks.
But wait, the analysis we are looking at makes a crucial distinction here. It argues that this endless one-way accumulation of debt isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
And to explain this, there's an analogy I really love: pasta versus the pot.
It's an excellent, simple way to conceptualize the difference between good debt and bad debt.
Walk me through it.
Imagine an economy that takes on a loan to produce a plate of pasta. That pasta is served, it's eaten, it's consumed, and its value is gone forever.
It's just a meal.
Yes. If you borrowed money to make that pasta, you now have a lingering debt, you have to pay interest on it, and you have absolutely nothing of value left to show for it.
That is bad debt.
That is bad debt. It was used for immediate, fleeting consumption.
But if that same economy takes on debt to produce a durable, high-quality cooking pot, that pot isn't consumed.
Right.
It can be used to make thousands of plates of pasta over the next decade. The pot retains its value and actively helps grow the economy's future output.
Exactly.
That is good debt. It wasn't just consumption, it was an investment in future capacity.
We can look at this on an individual level with student loans.
Oh, that's a great example.
Student loans are heavily debated and often framed purely as a crisis, but macroeconomically speaking, they are a prime example of the pot analogy.
Let's explore that, because if an 18-year-old takes out $50,000 in student loans, they are borrowing perhaps 3 times their current annual income from working like a part-time retail job.
Which sounds crazy.
Right. On paper, borrowing 300% of your income sounds insanely reckless, but they are making a highly targeted investment in their own human capital.
Exactly.
They're acquiring specialized skills that will significantly boost their long-term career value and earning potential.
They are turning themselves into the pot.
Oh, I love that.
They will produce far more economic output over their 40-year career with that engineering or nursing degree than they would have without it, which more than justifies the initial heavy debt burden.
And governments do the exact same thing on a massive macro scale. When a government borrows billions of dollars to build a new high-speed rail line, or upgrade the national electrical grid to handle more capacity, or fund advanced university research into AI or biotechnology, they are building pots.
They are.
They are creating long-term infrastructure that allows private businesses to operate more efficiently. And that efficiency creates a more robust economy, which directly translates into job market stability for you, the listener.
And, the uncomfortable reality that many people struggle to accept is that debt is actually a strict requirement for modern economic growth.
Wait, a requirement?
Yes.
Yeah.
Without it, the machine stops. Look at China right now. 19% of all government spending in China is funded by debt. 1 in every 5 yuan spent by the state is borrowed.
That's significant.
In the U.S., it's even higher. Roughly 25% of the entire federal budget is borrowed money.
25%. Just to visualize that, that is equal to all the money the U.S. spends on education, transportation, and welfare combined.
It's massive.
A quarter of the government's entire footprint is fueled by borrowed money.
So consider what happens if politicians suddenly decide debt is purely evil. If the government were to suddenly prioritize paying down the debt and drastically stopped borrowing that 25%, the ripple effects would be devastatingly fast.
Because they stop spending.
Right. If they stop spending that money, thousands of private businesses who rely on government contracts suddenly earn less. Those businesses have to fire workers.
Right.
Those unemployed workers lose their income and immediately stop spending at local restaurants and hardware stores. The local stores close.
The very loop that grows the economy violently reverses and begins to shrink it.
Exactly.
So, bringing this back to everyday life, macro concepts like national debt aren't just abstract figures debated on financial news networks. They are directly, intimately tied to your job security.
They really are.
If the government fails to use countercyclical policy, or if they suddenly pull the plug on borrowing and spending, your specific industry, your specific job, suffers almost immediately.
Which is why, in many fundamental ways, we are trapped in this system. Debt fuels the growth. Stopping the debt means stopping the growth.
Yeah.
It is a perpetual motion machine that must be fed.
Okay, so the debt cycle is essential, but it guarantees the debt will keep rising forever. And we're currently at $300 trillion globally. This sounds incredibly dangerous.
It does.
It feels like we are blowing up a balloon that mathematically has to pop at some point. But what if we zoom out? What if we look at the other side of the planetary ledger?
Okay, let's do that.
What does the planet actually own compared to what it owes?
This is perhaps the most important context of this entire deep dive, because focusing strictly on the 300 trillion liability is only looking at half the balance sheet.
Right.
Yes, global debt is currently 3 times the size of global GDP. But what about global assets? What is the value of the things we've actually built with all that debt?
And the numbers here are even harder to comprehend than the debt. If you add up the value of every single asset on planet Earth, every suburban house, every manufacturing factory, every stock portfolio, every mile of paved road, every piece of patented intellectual property, the total value of global assets in 2021 was roughly $1 quadrillion.
$1 quadrillion. It's an immense, almost unfathomable figure.
It's a million billions.
Right. And when you do the basic accounting, when you subtract the 300 trillion in planetary debt from that 1 quadrillion in planetary assets, you get a global net worth of positive $700 trillion.
So on paper, humanity is doing phenomenally well. We are richer than we have ever been in the entire history of the species.
Technically, yes.
The planet, as a single corporate entity, is fundamentally highly solvent.
The balance sheet is undeniably heavily positive. But we have to look much more closely at who actually holds that wealth, and more importantly, what that wealth is actually made of.
Okay, let's break that down.
First, the ownership breakdown is staggering. 95% of all that global wealth is owned by households and individuals, or the private corporations they invest in.
95%.
Yes, governments, despite their immense geopolitical power and massive spending, own only 5% of the world's wealth.
That is wild. The entities carrying the massive sovereign debts, the governments that owe the 300 trillion, only own 5% of the assets. In fact, many governments, including the U.S. federal government, essentially have a negative net worth. They technically owe far more than they physically own in federal land, military equipment, and buildings.
But the deeper issue and the real systemic danger moving forward isn't just who owns the assets. It's the nature of the assets themselves.
What do you mean?
We have a massive growing problem with unproductive wealth.
You're talking about the real estate dilemma.
Exactly. Of that 1 quadrillion in global assets, all the real estate in the world combined is valued at roughly $350 trillion.
Okay, that's a huge chunk.
But if you break that $350 trillion down, only about $100 trillion represents the actual physical buildings, the houses, the skyscrapers, the physical structures that people labored to build.
Meaning the remaining $250 trillion is just the dirt underneath the buildings.
Yes. 2.5 times the entire global GDP is tied up purely in the speculative value of land. And land, fundamentally, is an unproductive asset.
Wait, explain that. Why is land considered unproductive compared to something else?
If I own a plot of land, it has value, right?
Yeah.
It has value, yes, but it doesn't produce new value in the way other investments do. Think of it this way. If an economy takes $1 billion and invests it into researching a revolutionary cure for a disease or developing a new, highly efficient solar panel technology, that investment creates entirely new technologies.
Right.
And that will vastly increase the future output, efficiency, and health of the population. It fundamentally expands what the economy is capable of doing.
That's building a massive pot for the future.
Exactly. But if an economy pours that same $1 billion into simply buying up existing plots of land in major cities like London or San Francisco, it doesn't change the fundamental nature of that land.
It's still just land.
Right. The dirt doesn't suddenly produce more food. It doesn't invent a new microchip. It just becomes more expensive dirt. It just sits there, absorbing capital.
So basically, we have this massive planetary bank account of $1 quadrillion, which sounds great, but a huge disproportionate chunk of it is tied up in incredibly expensive mud instead of being invested in robots, medical research, and new factories.
That is the long-term creeping danger of our current global debt structure. Global wealth, the total value of our assets, has grown by 50% in the last 50 years.
Okay.
But economic output, the actual productive capacity of the world to make things and solve problems, hasn't kept pace with that massive asset inflation.
Wow.
The true value of the economy is increasing on paper, but it's driven heavily by speculation on land rather than fundamental leaps in human production.
And this directly affects everyday life. This is precisely why housing feels incredibly unaffordable for younger generations.
That's exactly why.
When cheap debt flows easily into speculating on dirt, skyrocketing land prices lock ordinary working people out of homeownership.
Right.
But worse than that, on a macro level, it diverts vital investment capital away from creating the new companies, the new technologies, and the new industries that would eventually hire those exact same people.
We are enriching the balance sheet without enriching the productive capacity of the society.
That's a great way to put it.
Investors are choosing to park their money in expensive land in advanced economies because real estate feels safer, rather than taking a risk on building factories in developing nations or funding unproven clean energy tech.
So the global balance sheet is technically positive, but it's heavily reliant on unproductive assets. And ultimately, this entire structure relies on confidence.
100%.
The belief that the debt will be paid, that the land is actually worth the astronomical price, and that the closed-loop cycle will continue indefinitely, which forces us to ask the terrifying question, what happens when that confidence breaks?
Because while advanced economies have seemingly mastered the art of rolling over their debt indefinitely, this system is absolutely not invulnerable.
Having a national debt-to-GDP ratio near 100% is now considered completely normal. 30 years ago, if a country hit 100%, it would have been viewed as a catastrophic red alert emergency.
Oh, sirens would have been blaring.
But today, we barely blink. The system worked fine as long as borrowing remains relatively cheap, and lenders remain confident that they will get their 4.5% return.
The breaking point occurs when risk unexpectedly enters the equation. If investors, those massive pension funds, those commercial banks, foreign governments, suddenly look at a country and start to doubt its ability to repay its bonds, the mood shifts instantly.
They get nervous.
Very nervous. To compensate for what they perceive as a higher risk of not getting paid back, investors demand higher interest rates to buy that country's bonds.
Right.
They say, I'm not lending to you for 4.5% anymore. I need 8% to take on this risk.
And when borrowing costs shoot up like that, the government is completely trapped. A massive slice of their annual budget has to be diverted just to pay the surging interest on their old loans instead of funding new schools, paying public workers, or maintaining infrastructure.
Yes.
So what are the actual options for a country when the bills come due, the lenders get nervous, and the borrowing gets too expensive?
Option one is always the most mathematically tempting for governments, but historically it is deeply destructive. Mint more money. If a sovereign nation controls its own fiat currency, it can theoretically just turn on the digital printing presses and create the money needed to pay off its debt.
But the downside to that is massive, right? You can't just create wealth out of thin air without a consequence.
The inescapable consequence is inflation. When you pump billions or trillions of newly created dollars or pesos or yen into the system without a corresponding increase in actual goods and services, you dilute the value of every existing unit of currency.
Right.
Prices rise rapidly, the purchasing power of savings shrinks, and ordinary people become significantly poorer, even if they have the exact same amount of money sitting in their bank account.
Look at what happened in Venezuela in the late 2010s. It's the extreme cautionary tale of option one.
Absolutely.
The Venezuelan government was drowning in massive debt obligations, largely tied to falling oil prices, so they simply ran the printing presses to cover their shortfalls.
And it was a disaster.
They printed so much money so quickly that the currency lost its value almost entirely. The price of everyday goods would double every few weeks. A simple loaf of bread that used to cost 10 bolivars suddenly cost millions of bolivars. People were weighing cash on scales instead of counting it because there were too many bills.
It becomes an economic death spiral. Ordinary people saw their entire life savings vanish overnight. And importantly, it wasn't because a bank physically took their money, but because the money itself became worthless paper. The wealth was inflated away.
So printing your way out of debt is essentially a nuclear option that destroys the domestic economy. What is option two?
Option 2 is default. This is when a country simply throws up its hands, looks at its creditors, and says, "We cannot pay you back. We are breaking the promise."
It's the sovereign equivalent of missing a mortgage payment and letting the bank foreclose, except instead of losing a single house, the entire national economy collapses.
Look at the crisis in Greece, starting in roughly 2008 and 2009.
Oh, that was brutal.
When the global financial crisis hit, international investors panicked. They looked closely at Greece's massive debt load and decided Greek bonds were simply too risky. They stopped lending.
Wow.
Almost overnight, Greece was cut off from the global debt fountain. They couldn't issue new bonds to pay for old ones, and they quickly ran out of money to operate the state.
And the devastation there was immediate and brutal. Because they couldn't borrow, they had to implement savage austerity. 1 in 4 public workers were fired, pensions were slashed, wages across the country fell by 30%.
It was devastating.
Over the next few years, the Greek GDP shrank by a staggering 25%. A quarter of their entire economic output vanished. And the worst part is, they couldn't just borrow their way out of the crisis to cushion the blow because nobody wants to lend money to a nation that just proved it won't pay you back.
Which exposes a brutal, fundamental double standard in the global debt system.
What?
We spent a lot of time talking about the U.S. owing $36 trillion, but the United States, much like Germany or Switzerland, enjoys an immense structural privilege.
Which?
The U.S. borrows in its own currency, the dollar, which happens to be the world's reserve currency. Because American bonds are perceived globally as the ultimate safe haven, the U.S. can endlessly roll over its debt at relatively low rates, no matter how large the number gets.
But if you are a developing nation, you don't have that luxury. You are caught in a vicious systemic trap.
Yes.
Countries like Sri Lanka or Pakistan don't have the luxury of printing world reserve currencies. Nobody in Europe or Japan wants to buy a 10-year bond denominated in Sri Lankan rupees because they fear the rupee will lose its value.
Exactly.
So to get favorable loans to build infrastructure, developing nations often have to borrow in foreign currencies, usually US dollars.
And this is exactly where the trap snaps shut. In economics, borrowing in a currency you can't print is sometimes called the original sin.
Wow. Original sin.
If a developing nation borrows $1 billion to build a port, and suddenly their own local currency weakens against the dollar, maybe because of a global recession or a shift in U.S. interest rates, that debt becomes overwhelmingly, crushingly expensive to pay back.
Right, because of the exchange rate.
Exactly. They have to earn more and more of their local currency just to buy the dollars needed to pay the interest.
Hold on. So if the U.S. prints money to pay its debt, it causes domestic inflation but stays afloat. But if a developing nation can't print U.S. dollars to pay their dollar-denominated debt, they just default and collapse. Are we basically exporting our financial stability at their expense?
It is a profound structural inequality built into the system. Developing nations are frequently forced to continuously borrow new money just to meet the rising interest payments on past loans.
Which is terrible.
Yeah, it drains their national resources away from internal development like education and healthcare and funnels it straight back into the global debt loop, largely enriching investors in advanced economies.
And when this massive, complex system starts looking fragile across the board, when inflation spikes globally or defaults loom in emerging markets, we see a massive psychological shift in the markets.
Yes, we do.
Capital flees. When the complex web of paper promises and digital IOUs looks shaky, investors instinctively look for things that are tangible, things that are real.
We see this exact phenomenon playing out in the markets right now, with a massive surge into hard, tangible assets.
Let's look at the actual market movements happening right now in 2025. Look at gold. Gold is up nearly 28% this year alone. Silver just hit a 30-year high. At the exact same time, the US dollar is down almost 9%, trading at a 3-year low.
These are not arbitrary random fluctuations in a vacuum. This is the market directly reacting to sovereign debt anxiety.
It's capital fleeing to safety. Major financial institutions are making massive bets on this fragility. JP Morgan is projecting gold could reach $4,000 an ounce by mid-2026.
Right.
And we see this reflected in the capital flowing heavily into resource portfolios. There are companies like Gold Mining Inc., ticker GLDG, which act as a massive hedge against this fiat fragility.
The mechanics of how a company like that operates illustrate exactly how investors seek shelter during debt anxiety. It's about securing tangible, measured resources in the ground, when the paper systems above ground look unstable.
Wait, hold up. The data on companies like this usually says they hold things like measured and indicated gold plus inferred ounces. For example, GLDG holds an estimated 12.4 million ounces of measured and indicated gold equivalent across 5 countries, plus another 9.1 million ounces inferred.
Right.
What does that actually mean? Because inferred sounds like a fancy Wall Street way of saying we have a hunch there's shiny rocks in the dirt. How does an investor actually value a guess?
That's a great catch, and it's vital to understand the mechanics of resource hedging. In the mining world, those aren't just guesses. They are very strict, legally regulated definitions.
Okay, so what is measured and indicated?
Measured and indicated means geologists have drilled enough holes, taken enough physical core samples, and mapped the underground geology so thoroughly that they have a high degree of mathematical certainty the gold is there, and they know exactly what grade it is. It's bankable proof.
Okay, so that's the hard proof. You can literally take that to a bank.
Exactly.
Ah.
Inferred means they know the geological structure continues along the same trend. They have some preliminary drill results, but they haven't mapped it densely enough yet to guarantee the exact tonnage.
Got it.
It's an educated, scientifically backed projection, but with a wider margin of error. But when you combine them, you get a massive pool of tangible assets. A company like that is also sitting on over $150 million in publicly traded equity holdings and millions in cash.
Wow.
When large active mining companies inevitably run out of gold in their current mines, they have to replace what they pull out of the ground. To do that, they look to acquire resource-heavy portfolios like this. It is a scramble for tangible, proven value.
And we must be incredibly clear, just maintaining absolute neutrality here. For you listening, we aren't prescribing financial advice.
Not at all.
But presenting these market movements strictly as factual responses to macroeconomic conditions is crucial. When major players like BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, or Goldman Sachs start taking significant positions in physical resource companies, they are signaling a macroeconomic defensive posture.
Exactly. They are mathematically hedging against the possibility that the $300 trillion debt fountain might sputter.
It's a sobering reminder of the actual stakes involved here. A national default, a currency crisis, or a massive spike in borrowing costs isn't just numbers shifting rapidly on a screen in a Wall Street server farm.
No, it's very real.
It means your life savings could be actively eroded by inflation, or your wages slashed overnight in a government austerity crisis. The global debt loop is intimately, inextricably tied to your personal financial reality.
The entire global system is designed for perpetual motion. It must keep moving, it must keep generating economic growth, and it must keep borrowing to sustain itself.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's summarize the incredibly complex web we've unpacked. Debt isn't a shadowy cabal of foreign masterminds secretly controlling our lives from a smoke-filled room.
Thankfully, no.
It is a $300 trillion closed-loop water fountain fueled by our own savings, our pensions, and our bank accounts. It is the engine driving an economy that relies on endless, perpetual growth to function, pulling resources from tomorrow to build the world of today.
And while that massive planetary liability is technically backed by $1 quadrillion in global assets, we have to acknowledge the reality that a massive portion of that wealth is just very expensive, unproductive dirt.
Yeah.
The entire system relies utterly on human confidence and the ironclad promise of future productivity.
It's a brilliant, terrifying, and awe-inspiring human machine. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over. Something we haven't touched on yet, but that changes the math of everything we've discussed.
Oh, this is the big one.
If global debt is fundamentally borrowing from our future selves, as we established with the grain analogy, and every single liability in the system requires future economic output and future human growth to settle the balance.
Right.
What happens to this massive, delicate, perpetual motion loop when global population growth stops? What happens over the next 50 years when demographics shift, the global working population actually shrinks, and there are literally fewer future selves around to pay the $300 trillion bill?
That is a question that should keep every macroeconomist on the planet up at night.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the financial systems around you, keep looking beneath the surface, and we will see you next time.